Hey, it's me, Rob Ryan, and I am back with another episode of Entrepreneurial Thinkers, an incredible conversation with my friend Thomas Logstrup Riebs from Traksjon here in Los Angeles. And you know why you should care about this episode? Because if you're an entrepreneur, if you're an investor, if you're a business leader or a civic leader, and you've ever thought about expanding your company, your products, your services outside of your home city or home market, I'm going to almost guarantee you don't know how to do that effectively. And especially if you are a European business leader, European company CEO or founder, entrepreneur, investor, you're contemplating coming to attack the US market, right? And coming to land here to successfully land and expand your business and your products in the country, in the city of Los Angeles, in the state of California, in any region here. I'm going to, again, pretty certainly tell you don't know how to do it. And that's what Thomas and I talk about. We talk about how to build bridges, not walls. We talk about how to build relationships, how to appropriately expand and articulate your business in different cultures. We share a lot of our common experiences. Him having a multicultural, multi-ethnic background, being born and raised and growing up in Denmark, and then coming to the US and Southern California to establish his life, and now leveraging all that expertise. We share some of my own stories of my mid-40s expedition to Latin and South America, and how I applied a lot of his principles before we knew each other to help me to build relationship networks and successful business opportunities throughout a region that I had never been to before, where I didn't speak the language. So that's what we talk about. We talk about expansion. We talk about the global world that we play in. And we also talk about some of today's pressing in February 2025, some of today's pressing cultures which make that more difficult and how to navigate it. So I hope you enjoy this episode as much as he and I did making it. Hola, hello, hi, bienvenido. And you know, it's funny is today I wish I knew how to say welcome or hello in Danish, but we'll get to that later. Welcome back or welcome to Entrepreneurial Thinkers. This is the show where, as you know, I get to have weekly conversations with some of the best and brightest entrepreneurial thinkers across all sectors and segments of society and industry, as we come together to try to lead this world a little bit better than we found it, which frankly today I think we need to work on doing even more so than ever before. I'm super excited today to be joined by my friend Thomas Logstrup Riebs, who's the partner at Traksjon, the gateway agency for Nordic companies to come and thrive here in the United States. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Thomas before we get to meet him, and then we're going to dive in and he's going to help us understand all of the things that I just teased in that little description of he and his company. So Thomas, in my humble opinion, is a modern day American success story. He's an immigrant who discovered himself here and the world, the larger world in the United States while he was younger, builds amazing relationships, built a life contributing to our collective growth and well-being. And in the process, he's become uniquely expert in helping companies and leaders from his homeland and the region to more effectively navigate the vast size, complexities, and opportunities here in the United States. Breaking into the U.S. market is no small feat, especially for European companies navigating cultural, regulatory, and business differences. And yet Thomas and his firm specialize in making that transition seamless with expertise that spans everything from environmental sustainability to strategic partnerships and hands-on execution and relationship development. He's built this life of his and this business that we're going to talk about upon a world-class education from UCLA, where he graduated having studied history and law. Built that into a diverse career that has led him to executive leadership and board roles with a number of different organizations, such as the Bank of the West, the Danish American Business Council, Axel, the LA Metro Sustainability Council, Flare Capital, and now Traksjon. And in this journey, he's established himself as one of the go-to leaders for global business insights and relationships here in Los Angeles and the Southern California area at large. He's a master relationship capitalist, as I like to say, and a proud and loud advocate of what we refer to in our culture here locally as Long LA, whether it's launching zero emission solutions for the LA Olympics or scaling water tech innovations to better insulate our climate challenges. He's all about turning global vision into US success stories. And he's here today to help us explore the entrepreneurial thinking mindset that's required to build this over a career. Thomas, welcome to Entrepreneurial Thinkers, buddy. It's great to share the show with you.
Hey, thanks, Rob. It's great to be here. Man, listening to you talk about what I do makes it sound a lot more impressive than I certainly feel like it is. So thank you for that.
My
Terrific
pleasure.
introduction.
No, my pleasure.
One slight correction that I will say, that we don't exclusively focus on Nordic companies, but but the broader European, just the broader European business community.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, for one thing, I talk to people about this all the time. The strongest, longest, most valuable, and most dynamic business relationship in the world is between the UK and the US, and has been since before the revolution. So
Yeah, no, I agree, and thank you for that. Thank you for the clarification. Ironically, in some of the conversation that we're going to have later, with a couple of the questions I have, we're going to broaden it out, and we're going to make sure we talk
good.
about kind of the whole of Europe. But before we get to that, I do want to dive back into your roots a little bit. And so my first kind of just wide open question is: are Nordic folks like great entrepreneurial thinkers?
Well, yes and no, and I say this in. They're very entrepreneurial in their mindset, in that you learn that critical thinking early on. So having had kids who've grown up in the US school system, it was really an eye-opener for me, because I've never had just one teacher per grade level. I mean, starting in the first grade, where I went to school, you started with English as a foreign language, which it wasn't a foreign language to me. My dad's American, born in Toledo, grew up in northern Indiana, met my mom on an exchange program, classic story. So all three of us kids learned Danish and English, but we started with geography and history and all kinds of other subjects in the first grade, not with one teacher. I think it's a better way, because kids get to see other things, but you also are less focused on multiple choice. I mean, very early you start actually like writing and reading and responding to what you've written, and it's more important what happened during the reign of a particular king, or what were the effects of a particular war, than remembering what the specific dates were. If your remember is in the 17th century, great. What were the effects in the 18th and 19th centuries? So from that perspective, entrepreneurial in that it instills in kids a lot of curiosity. Also, kids get to play a lot. Lego, of course, is Danish, although a lot of people don't know this. And it comes from the Danish words for play well, leg godt, L-E-G, new word G-O-D-T. That's what what that word comes from. And so playing well and being outside and looking at, just seeing a bunch of different things, creates this curiosity, I feel, at least in Scandinavia. Where I say maybe not so much is entrepreneurial in the business sense, maybe not so much, because it seems to me that certainly that Nordic people, that Scandinavians are more risk averse.
Okay.
And that may have something to do, in my mind at least, with the way that society is structured, that perhaps because a lot of things are easier, because you don't move as much. I mean, here, you send your kids to college across the country, and then they get their bachelor's degree. Someone here in LA sends their kids to New York, and then they go to San Francisco or someplace else, to Chicago, to get their master's degree, and they're exposed to a bunch of different things where it's not that it's really profoundly risky, but it creates an openness to new things in a different way than growing up in Scandinavia does.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, the way I'm hearing it is, if you're fortunate enough to grow up with that level of critical thinking being taught, as you say, that kind of exploratory mind, right? So an entrepreneurial mind in the broadest sense of the word, and then maybe emigrate to the U.S. or wind up coming to the U.S. with your family as a young person, or coming to the U.S. to study, which would be a more common thing for maybe some more people, right? Then maybe you get exposed to that more risk tolerant, kind of entrepreneurial, businessy mindset, like independent, go build it, go make it yourself kind of vibe. And the combination of those two, it might just produce someone like you.
Well, it's interesting you say, because at the same time as I say this, that the entrepreneurial mindset perhaps in business isn't quite as vibrant. I mean, Denmark's a small country with like literally roughly half the population of LA County, and has the largest logistics company in the world, the largest container shipping line, or used to be at least, in the world, one of the largest toy companies, one of the largest medical companies in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly has people who have left Denmark and who have gone and been very successful in business, both in starting businesses but also in leading businesses around the world. And being exposed to other things is also part of growing up in Scandinavia, because people do have more vacation and they actually take vacation. Right. And traveling is a big thing. I remember being in the south of France for the first time with my wife, who's from here, and we're staying at a bed and breakfast, and the French hosts say, "Oh yeah, oh, so great to see you. It's going to be all full here, and we're going to be joined by a Belgian family." And he rolls his eyes and he says, "Well, you know how the Belgians are. They drive everywhere." And my wife is like, "What does he mean?" And I'm like, "This is a trick question, because the Belgians, are known in Europe for driving everywhere. They drive far." And so, over the next week or so, when we're in the south of France, we see, and I point out Belgian license plates everywhere.
That's funny.
Like, wow, they really do drive a lot.
That's funny, right? Well, the difference between, say, and for those that will watch this on YouTube, Thomas has a beautiful U.S. map behind him, very kind of a creatively styled U.S. map. And it just makes me think, as you're describing that, right, how you could overlay Europe or parts of Europe into parts of the U.S. and how the vastness of the United States changes kind of the dynamic. But at the same token, in Europe, where you have different countries, different cultures, et cetera, here we have different regional cultures, right, that affect kind of how people perceive things or how they interact or how they carry themselves. So there are people from different parts of the U.S. that are more autocentric than I guess some other people in other parts of the U.S. are less autocentric, although we're all generally pretty autocentric.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so you've teased a couple of things that I want to talk about kind of right at the top, because I think helping establish an understanding of you and kind of the vastness of your life story and your experiences helps us then kind of get into the business discussion we're going to get into. So tell us a little bit about you. Like, how did you talk about your dad already in the background of the family? So how did you come to grow up? How did you come to the United States? And then eventually maybe kind of what pulled you to stay here in the U.S.?
Well, one of the things that I like to tell people is, like I've seen the sort of the opportunities in doing business across the Atlantic since I was a kid. And this goes back to well before I was born, but my mom, who, like everyone in her generation, would knit and crochet and whatnot. They were visiting with some friends when they were in northern Indiana, excuse me, and people were like, "Well, what the heck are you doing here?" Because knitting in that way was pretty much already in the early 60s was lost in the U.S. And she's like, "Well, I'm just knitting a sweater for my father-in-law." And that led to, when I was a kid, we were living in Skane, in the northernmost part of Denmark. My parents had 350 women sitting all over Denmark at home, doing what they would already be doing, knitting homemade sweaters, but based on my mom's designs. They would then ship them back to my family, and my mom would sew in stitch in the tags, and they would get sent to high-end department stores like Lord & Taylor, Saks Fifth Avenue, Neiman Marcus, and be sold at exorbitant prices in the U.S. Meanwhile, here I am, a kid, and I'm like, please, can someone just buy me a sweater, because I don't want another homemade sweater, please.
Right.
But my job when I was a kid was to go and find, Mrs. Peterson in Holstebro. She was, going to do 5 of this design. So I'm like, okay, well, I need 5 yarns of, 5 skeins of blue yarn, 5 skeins of white, so many red, whatever it was, according to the pattern. Put them in a box and type up the address label. And I just grew up with the fact that my parents were entrepreneurial and had a business. They saw an opportunity. My mom was sitting there knitting, and someone was like, "Well, could you knit me one?" And my mom was like, "Yeah, sure. This is no big deal. It's like, in the evening I'll have knit half the sweater anyway." And my dad was like, "Sure. We'll need to charge you a bit for it." And they're like, "Whatever it costs, I want one of those."
Okay.
And so they put this into system, and figured out, like, well, who do we call? Like, who would buy batches of these? Well, they're not going to be cheap because they're going to be handmade. We're going to have to ship them from Denmark, and this is in the early 70s, and it's like that's going to take a while. It's going to cost a bit. It's we're going to have to be compensated somehow for this, and so they settled on the higher end market. So this is really what I grew up with.
Yeah, you were born into an entrepreneurial thinking family.
Yeah. And then, my grandparents, my American grandparents lived in Elkhart, Indiana. My Danish grandparents lived in Viby outside of Aarhus, Denmark, which is the second largest city in Denmark. And spent my first birthday in Indiana, my second birthday in Denmark. And so traveling back and forth and getting really a deep insight into both my cultural heritage and my people heritage. And I've heard this term, third culture kid, which I really like, because it's like, I tell people this frequently, I was an American growing up in Denmark, and I'm a Dane living in the US, because I'm not a typical American and I'm not a typical Dane. I was, growing up in Denmark, everyone has a flagpole. You hoist the flag on your birthday, and so we would hoist the American flag. And here, I have like Danish flag, and you see my cufflinks are Danish flags here. So it's interesting being sort of between this space. Yeah. The way I came to be in the US was I was offered a job working for a friend's parents in Orange County in Santa Ana. And lo and behold, after having been there for some time, one of my vendors calls me up and says, "Hey, I have a friend that you should meet." And as they say, the rest is history. But that friend is now my wife, and we have 2 kids.
And still your friend.
Yes, exactly. And actually, it's funny because the vendor, who now no longer is my vendor, but was my wife's best friend at the time, and still is, and we still see her, and we still talk about, she'll still be like, you really owe me still because I introduced the two of you.
That's awesome. And you said 2 kids?
2 kids.
And you live here, for people who don't understand the context, you live a little bit south of us here in Los Angeles, but in the greater...
To the east, actually. So I live in the San Gabriel Valley, east of LA, east, southeast, I guess, but people who don't understand the context, they've heard of the valley. I live in a valley, but not in the valley.
No, exactly. And for most people outside of this area that listen to this show, it's all greater Los Angeles. And so
yeah. I tell people in Europe this. I live in an unrecognized, unknown suburb of 95,000 people, which would be the 5th largest city in Denmark. And people drive by and they don't even notice that there's a city here because, it's such massive metropolis that you never actually leave the city and go to the next city.
It's interesting. You mentioned in the opening comments about the entire country of Denmark being about half. I think you said about half the population of, say, Los Angeles County, right? Which is an often discussed thing in the context of the U.S. as well, right? The fact that Los Angeles County is actually larger than, I think, all but 4 states in the United States.
It's my favorite. I forget if it's Jeopardy or Trivial Pursuit, but it's like how many states have a population smaller than LA County. Last time I heard the answer was 41, right, including California. But it goes to the question also of if you are a business in Europe and you are coming into the U.S. market, whatever that might mean. And maybe I'm skipping ahead to something we'll talk about later. But
actually, you're about to create the best segue ever. So thank you.
People tell me this all the time. We get these referrals and like, we're focused on the U.S. market. I'm like, no, you're not. No, we definitely are. It's like that is the very definition of not focus. How could you possibly be focused? Once in a while, I get like I'll ask people random questions like, really? Okay, so what are you doing in Alaska? They're like, what? Alaska? Nothing. Well, last time I checked, that's a part of the U.S.
Right.
And what we tell people is you got to focus on one customer, one locale, one place. And even just being in LA County is so massive that how could you possibly be focused even on LA County? Or if it's a smaller place, I mean, how could you possibly be focused on Wyoming? Because smaller population, but geographically so massive.
Now you look at that, even in the first qualifying conversations with prospective clients, you're already providing value, right?
Well, thank you.
That's the key right there. All right, so let's talk about that, right? So this is kind of, to me, it's like an elephant in the room type of question right away here, because of the current climate that we're in, geopolitically, culturally, et cetera. It's already tough enough for European companies to come over and find a successful path into the US markets, as you say, for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons being just the most obvious one that you already stated, a lack of understanding of the market and kind of how do you focus in on it. But my question today for you is, how much more challenging is that already challenging reality being made by this current situation within our U.S. government at the federal level?
Well, it is significantly more challenging. It really is. Uncertainty is the enemy of business investments. Because if you're investing, if you're planning on building a factory, well, if you're a Finnish company, it's a real example, building a plant in North Carolina for electric vehicle chargers, and now the federal government all of a sudden is saying, you know what, we're going to stop investing in public chargers. Okay, well, we invested in this and our factory is now done, and we were planning on taking advantage of all this because this is a leading technology that ties directly in with everything that you've said about public charging for electric vehicles in the broader context of the US highway network. Well, that's a problem. And then others who are looking at doing anything similar, they're like, well, is this going to change in 2 years, in 4 years? Is it going to ever get back to this? And so from a US perspective, if you want to attract investors, if you want to attract high-paying jobs, if you want to do things like we want to bring back manufacturing, first of all, that's going to take a long time, because if the manufacturing is overseas, if it's an American company manufacturing overseas, it's going to take time to figure out the best location, build a plant, hire people, and bring it back. If it's a foreign company, which of course, the German Chancellor Merkel said this well in Trump's last period as president, the biggest exporters of cars from the United States are German car manufacturers. So it is definitely considerably more challenging. It's much more uncertain. However, one of the things that I say that is the same, that has not changed, is network is everything. You need someone who will tell you the unvarnished truth, who won't try to sell you on, well, you should really be here because we have this one thing that you really like. Great, your company needs this one thing, but what about the other 5 or 10 things that are super important for your business? You need somebody else who's on your side, who is an independent, who can tell you, sure, you've got the energy that you need to run the plant, but what about your workforce? Do you have the workforce, or do you have enough? Is this a place where you can take people from overseas who are going to come lead this company and train your team in the US? Will they want to live here, and will they want to stay here? And then I will say also, one of the things in looking at the US that hasn't changed and that still shouldn't change is when you say things like we're focused on the US, that leads to confusing results, because like the day after the election, I got a call from one of our business partners who said, listen, we have a call with the CEO of a company in Europe at 7 o'clock your time. Can we just have a quick call? I have some questions. And the question was, is the green transition over now that Trump has been elected president?
Right.
And so the answer to that is no, because that is not decided by the White House. It's not decided by Congress. It's not decided by states. It's decided by individual business entities or utility companies. It also did not start when Biden was elected president. Right. In fact, what I tell people is, if you are focused on the green transition, it probably started in the US about 60 years ago in Los Angeles, in fact, because we had smog that was so bad that people think that we were in the middle of a gas attack.
Mm-hmm.
And there are great pictures of people wearing gas masks. Ronald Reagan was governor when the California Air Resources Board was started. This led to then tailpipe emission standards specific to California in the early 70s, which caused German car manufacturers to go to the EU through their chancellor and say, listen, we gotta, this is our biggest market. Not just California, Southern California in particular. We're home to the largest BMW and Mercedes, as far as I know, also Volkswagen and Porsche dealers in the world. And it's such an important market for them. So the EU and California are now leading on tailpipe emission standards. So it's a long way around to say the answer to the question that this person had was, first of all, if you sell green transition, whatever that might mean, to the White House, well, last person out the door turns off the light, locks the door, because then you may as well just shut your business, because then you're not odds are that the Trump administration, the Trump White House will not continue to buy green transition from your company.
Exactly.
But odds are very good that that is not in fact what you're selling, that you're solving a completely different problem, characterized completely differently, and that you need to go out and find the customers for whom you solve the problem that you're solving and talk to them. It's not Congress, it's not governors, it's probably not counties, it's probably not even cities, maybe it's a public utility company, maybe it's a private utility company, or maybe it's just a private company somewhere, and you need to go find them.
Yeah. You said a couple things that jumped off at me that I think are absolutely key for anybody that's listening, and for your clients, right? One is just in a time of uncertainty where there's a lot of information, both misinformation and disinformation, and also just a plethora of information that we can't be certain of how to sort through. One of the keys to any kind of expansion of any effort is an honest broker, right? So someone who you can truly trust. So in a sea of uncertainty, pick that person who speaks with certainty, who speaks with clarity, who speaks honestly, who although again, your firm obviously would love to sign on new clients and grow your own business as a firm. The truth is, you're also, I imagine, very selective in how you do that. And so you are truly giving the best practices advice to the clients and the companies and the CEOs and the leaders that you talk to about the reality, because you don't want them to come on here under false circumstances and then fail, because then that would reflect poorly on you. So that honest broker mentality is huge. And then the other thing I picked up, it segues kind of into the next thing I'd love to talk about, is I heard a bit of, the way to go global, the way to expand kind of to a United States market is to pick a local market that is very suited to, again, a clear definition of what exactly it is that you're selling or offering or doing. So in that context, right, you already teased the opportunities in this particular example you shared relative to Southern California or Los Angeles. You've lived here in Southern California now for almost as long as I have, just about, I think 25, 27 years. So, long time. So we've seen a lot change in the world since the, mid to late 90s to 2025 that we sit in. What is it about this market? What is it about this area, this region, that makes it such a good place or such a magnet for foreign companies to land and expand?
Well, a few things. I think it sort of depends on where you're coming from in terms of both geographically, culturally, but also like your solution, your problem, the problem that you're focused on. But there's so much of everything here. It's very dynamic. It's very diverse. One of the things that always really surprises people is that LA in particular is and has been the manufacturing capital of the US. And people are like, well, Michigan or Detroit or the Rust Belt, or that has to be it. Yeah, but there's a lot of manufacturing going on around here. There are a lot of international connections around here. There are a lot of really top some even world-class educational institutions here. I think the number, last time I heard a good statistic on this was like 5,500 and some engineers educated here every year. So if you are in the tech space, or if you're in any sort of technical space at all, really, you have people here. And once, honestly, people been to Southern California, they've lived here for 4 years or more, getting an engineering degree, moving back to colder climates or, a different part of the country that's less dynamic, might not be quite as attractive if you can get a job here and if there are companies coming in here. So it's like size, scale, and the dynamic nature of Southern California and of LA in particular.
I love that, and I also love that interesting kind of historical context, right? Because as we're learning now in our political reality, we have a lot of misinterpretations of our own history, right? And so the truth is, yes, like the Midwest. I'm born and raised in Chicago, so as Midwestern kind of Rust Belt as you could get, so to speak. And yes, 100 plus years ago, that was the manufacturing basis of the country. And also juxtaposed against that is the fact that Los Angeles, that we know today, is really a city almost completely born within the last 100 years.
Yes, exactly.
Right. I mean, if you trace back, I don't have the exact figures, but if you trace back, I think our population in like 1930 or 1920s, say 1925, say exactly 100 years ago, was like 1 million people or less. Right. I mean, maybe dramatically less than 1 million people if I had the statistics at hand. But the point being, right, what we know of it today is really happened in the last 100 years and even more dynamically, probably in the last 75 to 80 years since World War II. And so people lose sight of that. Like, and it's just size and scale. It's just, if there is an industry that is happening anywhere in the country and you pick it, like what comes of that industry's contribution from Los Angeles is somewhere in the top 4 all the time. Just all the time across like every industry.
Yeah, and then I mean, if you look at sort of the broader region, I mean, I think I forget the current numbers, but I was just looking up the California economy because I mean, California is a smidge behind Germany in sort of the official California GDP numbers, but a state GDP and a national GDP are not calculated the same. So I think we're like $450 billion rather, sorry, with a B, behind Germany, which is growing either very slowly or contracting slightly. And the California economy, I think, is projected to grow 2.5% to 3% this year. And it is so fast. And it moves quickly and it changes quickly. Whereas an economy like Germany or the Danish economy, I mean, it certainly grows, but it grows in a different way. And I think Southern California, including the LA region, is something like the 15th, 16th largest economy in the world. It's $1 trillion economy, which is like 50% larger than Saudi Arabia. And then when you when you talk to people, they're like, oh yeah, well, we have a team focused on the Middle East. Okay, well, how many people do you have focused on the U.S.? Oh, we have this guy. That's one guy. It's like, how?
We have this guy. We have this guy working out of his house in El Segundo or something.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. No, again, it's context and facts matter.
Yes.
Not to turn the whole show into kind of a subtextual commentary on politics, but in a world where facts don't matter as much right now, facts do matter.
Yeah.
And it's illuminating. And that's, again, I imagine the value of the advice that you're providing. Okay. There's a bunch of things I want to unpack related to kind of Nordic, but also just broader European business culture and some company examples. But before that, why don't you tell us about Traksjon? So we've alluded to it, but this is kind of your commercial. What does it do? Who are your clients? You don't have to talk about the financial part of it, but kind of like generally, broadly, like how do you get paid? How did they hire you? How do you find clients, or how do they find you? Help us understand some of those basics so people can walk away from listening to this, go like, okay, I've got this friend who runs this, Swedish company, and maybe I should introduce him to Thomas and the team.
Yeah, so we are advisors. So we're business advisors. We're not consultants. And I say this because I want to distinguish. We do specific things, but we help people figure out how to do things better. We clarify things for them. We highlight things. We're never going to be writing white papers, although of course you need to get some information to people, but we're not going to be writing 40, 50-page white papers. We're really more like the people who actually do stuff. Our motto is actions speak louder than words, so we would rather go and do something about it than write a long piece about it that is going to get shelved and analyzed, maybe if you're lucky. And we lead with curiosity. Our number one value is unrelenting curiosity. And we've spent some time coming to phrase it exactly this way because we have questions and more questions, and until people are sort of like, well, how many more questions could you possibly have? Oh, lots. Like, we have lots more questions, and broad questions that where we try to get people to think about things in a slightly different way, or think about how they're thinking about things. And when things like people say we're focused on the US, really, like how? Explain to me how that's going to help you. Or when they say, well, we're going to this trade show that everybody in our industry is going to be there. Okay, great. Are they all your clients? Because otherwise, I don't understand why we're talking about everybody in the industry is going to be there. You're not likely to meet with all 40,000 attendees of this trade show. So what's your plan? Like, how are you going to do this very practically and pragmatically? And that's also how we approach things, is practically, pragmatically, bring it down to do just one thing. There's this great American saying, how do you eat an elephant? Of course, you shouldn't be eating elephants because they're endangered,
right?
But
exactly.
it illustrates the point is like one bite at a time. So you need to digest everything and focus in on one digestible, one thing that you can do. So you can meet with one person, you can meet with one client, you can go to one place. You can't visit the US. You can visit Poughkeepsie or Santa Ana. Hard to visit all of Los Angeles. You could visit.
I was just going to say, yeah, I was going to say, you can't even visit. You think you can visit Los Angeles. You can't even visit all of Los Angeles' potential.
I mean, heck, even visiting a neighborhood, Silver Lake or Culver City. I mean, it's hard to visit one neighborhood because the scale. It's so massive. So
I would imagine. I have a question. Follow on, kind of. I would imagine this approach to business, to your advisory services that you guys provide to your prospective clients, weeds out a lot of unserious prospective clients, right? Like, so then that tells me that the part of the answer to like who are your clients, who does business with you, is more serious companies, more serious leaders. Doesn't necessarily imply that they have to be bigger versus smaller or this versus that, but it definitely implies to me that there's a level of seriousness and preparedness about the people that most likely wind up hiring you guys, because the others will just wash themselves out through the rigor of your questioning and your curiosity, and you're challenging them to think more deeply and specifically about their business. So with that said, how do these types of more serious clients and leaders in European countries, how do they find you guys? How do they find Traksjon?
Well, right now, all through referrals. So we have a pretty strong network, and we try to be in touch with people. We have a website, of course, Traksjon.com, and Traksjon spelled in Norwegian, Traksjon. So it's Traksjon.com. I publish a newsletter on LinkedIn called Traksjon in the US, but Traksjon spelled American in English.
Okay.
There's a LinkedIn page. You can email me, Thomas R at Traksjon.com. They can.
And you've said we a few times. Are there partners involved?
Yes.
How many? What are their backgrounds?
So a few different people. So another guy who's also an attorney like me, and a CPA who is in Seattle. A guy that comes from a marketing background. Another guy used to work for the UK Department of Business and Trade, and we have an aviation advisor based in Copenhagen. Who is a pilot and comes from the Danish Aviation Authority, Civil Aviation Authority, because we're pursuing some engagement in American companies who want to go to Europe, but who are in aviation, So we have a partner that's his specialty, and again, extremely well connected in the aviation industry, but also understands the regulatory landscape, which is also going back to being a lawyer like me. I went to law school not because I wanted to work at a law firm, but because the intersection of law and business is actually significantly more valuable and more difficult to navigate than it is in Europe. And so you need somebody who understands how to navigate that, um, and and also somebody who can then help you navigate it with lawyers who are very specialized in whatever solution you're working on. If it's a water technology company, odds are, maybe land use comes up, maybe environmental regulations come up, and although I'm not a specialist in any of those, having conversations with lawyers who are specialists in those fields, it makes it a lot easier for me to have those conversations with the legal specialist, and I have to literally translate for our clients, because legalese, is a whole different language.
So I've got two things I want to kind of combine together to pull off this a little bit further, right? So my humble perspective, just as kind of a geopolitics nerd and sociocultural, like people often joke, they say I'm basically just a closeted social anthropologist who never became a social anthropologist. So my perception from the outside has always been that like Nordic countries in particular, kind of the northern part of Europe, are renowned as some of the most innovative, forward-thinking countries. Right? They're really good at solving what I would say we're really bad at solving, right? The big societal problems for their citizens: good lifestyles, thriving economies, good education, healthcare, smart urban planning, plentiful public transit, high qualities of life, right? So you can tell me if that's right or wrong, but that's my perception. Now, with that perception, if that is accurate, I'm curious. We talked early on about maybe the personal cultural differences between being a European or a Nordic versus the entrepreneurial thinking mind we talked about right in the outset. Now, in this context, if the countries in the region are generally really good at building systems and institutions that attack these fundamental, huge societal needs, what are the strengths and or weaknesses of the companies that come from those regions when they come here to the US, right? So what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of companies that are built in that part of the world or led by people who think like that, who grew up in that kind of quality lifestyle, systemically stable environment when they come to the US?
Well, some of the strengths are that they do look at things that are they do look at the longer horizon. They're like, well, we need to figure out water conservation, not just how are we, what am I doing about water conservation? So I am doing this, but you need to figure out how to do this on a broader scale. And it's more, so that's a real strength. I think it's looking at the broader societal things and looking also at how is this a business opportunity. Um, One of the weaknesses, I think, is that Europe is very highly regulated, and as a result, it could also be difficult to innovate as quickly. But I will say, one of the things, of course, is like it's easier to sort of get people to have like your whole team with you. But there's also this consensus approach, certainly in the Nordic region where hierarchies are more flat. You can certainly expect to have a meeting with the CEO of your company, even though you might be a fairly good sized company. You might be likely to be on a first name basis with the CEO of the company. But this sort of consensus building approach can also be, it could be stifling for constructive risk taking. And I don't mean risk taking in the way that Reid Hoffman likes to talk about it. He says that being an entrepreneur is like jumping out of a plane and jumping out of a tall building rather, and building the airplane on the way down. And I vehemently disagree with that. I think very few entrepreneurs risk their lives for their solution. And in fact, there's some evidence that a more cautious approach or a more measured approach is more likely to to result in a successful venture. But I think sometimes in the Nordic countries, you're trying to be a little bit too measured. You're a little bit too cautious, and I think it's really played itself out that this ethos from Facebook, like move fast and break things, there was a little bit too much risk taking. But I think Nordic companies could do well in thinking about how does that compare to their approach? Like how likely are they to take a risk to do something, or do they need to have another white paper written about it? Do they need to have another committee to discuss it? Or could someone say, hey, listen, I've got a great idea, and I've got I have a contact. I want to go here. I want to do this. What would it take to go and do this? And
do you think that opening themselves up a bit to that type of leadership thinking might allow for a bit more experimentation?
Yes.
Right? A bit more of a product experimentation, a bit more of market.
Yes,
so to the point where like, hey, we might fail. We might fail in this pursuit. Doesn't mean we're going to fail overall, but we might fail in this pursuit, and counter to our normal Nordic culture, right, which wouldn't allow us to explore anything that might fail. Like this mindset opens it up to say like, okay, we could fail in that and we're still going to be fine, but we're going to learn a lot from that. So you think this could be opening that?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is a real weakness is that fail is considered like a 4-letter word, like it's a bad thing. Where I often give this example, like in two guys or two people sitting in Scandinavia talking, and they're like, oh, see the guy over there? Yeah, he's the guy. He just went bankrupt. Oh boy. Oh, that's not good. Whereas, two people in Southern California started to be like, hey, Rob, how's it going? Oh, well, we just have to close our business, but hey, we've started this other idea. Oh, great. Tell me about that. And it's like, oh, sorry to hear that. I thought things were going really well. Yeah, they were, but then, we ran out of money, and hey, we're doing this other thing, or, I started this other thing with somebody else. And it's not that the focus on failure is too much, whereas the focus on did we learn something that we can use to move forward is not enough in the Nordic countries. And whereas, and here maybe there's a little bit too much focus on, oh, I learned something, so it doesn't matter that I failed a bunch of times. But there's somewhere in there there's a better balance, and it's in some instances you'll go in one way and some the other.
Sure.
One thing that's interesting is we have this aviation advisor who's in Copenhagen. And we had a conversation with an American electric aviation company. We're like, yeah, we're in Germany. Okay, that's very interesting, but electric aviation is really difficult to figure out, and we don't have an aircraft that's actually certified by anybody yet. And yes, the Germans do like technology, but they're actually slower at adopting new technology. In particular, electric aviation is going to be really difficult because Germany's a really big country with a lot of people and big distances, whereas Denmark has, it's much smaller, there's smaller distances, and it's probably easier to figure out the regulations. And the Danish Prime Minister's come out and said, hey, we want to have zero carbon domestic aviation by 2030. So they're still trying to figure out like exactly what does that mean. Yeah. But like the Nordic people are definitely much faster at adopting new technology. Finland was the first country in the world to have more cell phones than landlines. And in part, of course, because Nokia was there, but also just like Nordic people have like, okay, yeah, cell phones, that's a great idea, let's do that. So they figured it out.
It was okay to skip ahead a kind of couple of generations of technology.
And
interesting. You mentioned Nokia, and you mentioned Lego in the opening comments. What are a couple other companies that folks might know, or they'd be surprised that they probably don't even realize that are from the region? Like some big brand names, just for
well, of course, Novo Nordisk is now probably a household name here because of Ozempic and Wegovy, or if it's not, then Novo Nordisk. But one of the things that very few people know is that Novo Nordisk is actually owned by a foundation, which is one of the reasons that they can really look at things through a much longer perspective. Carlsberg, one of the probably the best beer in the world, as they say in their commercials. Which I'm a terrible Dane, terrible German. My heritage also partly German because I don't drink beer at all, so I wouldn't know.
Although I was going to say the ironic placement of those two examples following one another, right? The fact that you brought up a beer brand right after the weight loss drug.
What else? Some of the don't know. I mean, a lot of things. I mean, a lot of just like Danish companies, I just take them for granted, and I don't even. I wouldn't even know. I keep
like in the broader region, like Spotify's from there, from that region, right?
Spotify's from there. Skype was founded by a Swedish guy and a Danish guy.
We just dated ourselves to all the kids listening.
Yes,
They're like, "What is Skype?"
Basically,
that was the Zoom before there was Zoom, folks.
WhatsApp was founded by a couple guys in Holland. So I mean,
the rest of the world's messengers. Thank you, Holland guys.
Exactly,
the Dutch guys. That's awesome. There's some good examples. And on that idea of examples, and I don't want to ask you to ever pick your favorite clients, and you can talk generically. You don't have to mention company names if you don't want to. But I would love if you have one or two kind of cool stories. I'm hesitant to call them success stories because people always put that what their perception of success is around that. So, are there one or two cool stories of companies that you and the Traksjon team have helped here in Los Angeles or in the region of Southern California?
Well, and since we really like to focus in. It's like success is such an elusive thing because like success you could be successful at something today, which is a part of an overall success. But I will say, like, I have a couple of cool examples. So we had a CEO from a Danish company here. His name happens to be Thomas also, and they're in the water space. And if he's listening, he'll recognize this conversation. But their focus is on saving water in the bathroom. And so he was here. We were looking at a bunch of different opportunities and sort of just talking broadly about what can you do here, who can you engage with, and I was introducing him to people. And we were at an event, and so people at the event are like, "So Thomas, what do you do?" "Oh, we're in the device business." I'm like, "Okay, Thomas, I'm just going to stop you there for a second. Thomas is not actually in the device business. He's in the behavior change business. They focus on changing behaviors, which, in order to do that, they need to tell people what their behavior is. So they need to give them information. They also try to change this behavior by giving them additional information. In order to do that, sure, they use devices, but the core of their business is behavior change." And then people are like, "Really? That's interesting." He looked at me, he's like, "Huh, that's an interesting..."
He's like, "I've never described myself that way. Thank you, Alternative Thomas."
And so one of the things that we do is we very much look at characterizing our clients' problems better than they can and being very focused. And this is one of the things that we are able to do through this unrelenting curiosity. The other thing is actually a thing where I misstepped. And we're working with a Finnish company, and they said, I put together this report for them after this market engagement, and they were very disappointed. The CEO was very disappointed. He said, "Well, I mean, the feedback wasn't very good." I was like, "What do you mean?" Everyone's like, "Hey, keep me posted, keep me posted." Yeah, but like, keep me posted. Like, what does that even mean? I'm like, yes, that's really good. Thank you for pointing that out. I totally missed that. That is actually super positive because the company didn't have a deadline, a starting line, an engagement point. They wanted to get information back from the market, but they didn't have, "We're opening a plant on June 1st.
Right.
We're starting here. We were open for new vendors. We're ready to take on material. We're ready for this. We can start on this date at this time in this place." And they're like, "We're going to start real soon."
Yeah, there wasn't that piece to compel interest.
Exactly. And so the interest was actually good because it's like, "Oh, this is what, keep me posted. Let me know when you're ready. Let me know when you get started."
Right.
But in their mind, the good feedback, the good response, the great sort of connection would have been, "Yeah, we're in. Let's sign a letter of intent."
Of course. Right. Yeah. Which again is just a mismatch between expectations and the reality in the market, and just that missing that one little component piece, right? That little, either part of the reality of their operations or part of their story narrative, which is just like we have started, so we don't have to let you know when we started. Nate, I apologize, I didn't explain that well enough.
And
Here's our timeline.
And I find it interesting,
right?
because even doing what I do and having done it for as long as I have, and I've thought about these problems for as long as I have, there's still things that, in retrospect, or even in the context of a conversation, become patently obvious to me. It's like, oh, by the way, it means something different than what you are hearing, and it's so interesting to me, because these misunderstandings are everywhere.
Yeah.
I speak to a lot of UK based companies, and I tell them, I ask them before I get started rambling on, I was like, what's the single largest obstacle to achieve commercial success for you? And they have a lot of good stuff: legal, scale, capital, time. It's like, no, it's language. And eventually, someone raises their hand and says, well, we do speak English here. I'm like, congratulations, we do not. It's like, right. It sounds like you do. I'm like, yes, but we speak American, which is not the same. And I used to give this example, like, if you say, I want to table the topic, here that means take it off the table. In the UK, it means put it on the table. Right. And there are a lot of great examples of this. And going back to Scandinavia, like if you're from a smaller town in Denmark, certainly the further west, the more modest you are. So you might say things like, hey, Rob, I have a solution that I think might be somewhat helpful to you in your operation, despite having some world-class technology.
Right.
Whereas Americans are very happy to say this is amazing and fantastic. And so Europeans come over here and they're like, well, they said it was amazing and fantastic, and they're going to call us. So, man, this is going to be great. I have all these business cards from this whatever thing that I went to. Right. And then they don't hear anything, because it could also mean, I have no idea what you're saying, but I'm going to be polite, and I'm going to give you this terrific compliment that you're amazing, Rob.
I love that. I love that you brought that up as an example. It's funny. I was going to add a question which I hadn't scripted earlier. Right. So I had some experience working back and forth in the UK. Years ago. Obviously, you and I have some British friends in common here, but most of them are Americanized, and so they have more of kind of fit to the culture. But I remember back in being in the UK, say 10, 11 years ago or so, and people would explain to me kind of the differentiation between, say, me and the vociferous, proud CEO of the software company that we were trying to help grow, was that guy probably in public meaning like a room with more than 6 people, right? Even of his friends or people that knew him, would never openly stand up and self-promote, right? It's just natively not British to be a self-promoter. Whereas the perception, right, is that the loud, proud American who will brag about everything and anything, whether it's true or not. And then, of course, the truth of an effective salesperson, effective leader, an effective promoter is somewhere in the middle, right? But I was curious, and you just answered it, right? Which is that there's that cultural kind of humility that then when you come to the U.S. market, you have to learn not just how to speak, which I love the way you articulated there, like speak the literal language of American business, but you also have to adapt your personality to be able to essentially represent yourself. If you don't like the word promote, as if it has some negative connotation to you, egotistically, like you have to adapt yourself to be able to represent yourself and your company and your products at a volume level that gets you heard
exactly
amidst the noise. Which that's got to be a fascinating thing to try and, I don't want to use the word teach necessarily, but to try and help advise your clients,
and maybe like to
get them to adapt,
to tease it out, right? Because it's like we do this thing where we take clients to trade shows, and like, oh well, we go to trade shows. I was just on, if you follow my newsletter, you will have read my latest post about trade shows, and I've been going to trade shows since the 80s, and I feel like nothing has really changed. And
yeah, really sad.
Yeah, I mean, I had a great conversation with this small Danish company, and they have this amazing technology where they've developed a blood vessel that isn't completely closed up a year after having been put into your body for whatever surgery you've had. And they have a picture of sort of the leading solution. And how are they presenting this? They have a folding table at the front of the booth with 4 stacks of brochures there, and which is like, that's not how you get people's attention. But what we do is we tell people there's a before, during, and after, and this is sort of broadly applicable to going to the US, regardless of how you're engaging with potential clients or partners in the market. You have to prepare like heck. If you're going to a trade show, figure out like who are the people here who are most similar to people who are clients that we already have, who are people who are likely to have the kind of problem that we've solved successfully elsewhere. Figure out a way to meet them, go get the information, get the database, reach out to them. And there are a lot of tools now where you can do this more efficiently.
Sure.
But then during the trade show, what we advocate is you want to go to the sessions where there's a panel and a moderator, sit in the front row, and when they finally get to the point where, does anyone have any questions, raise your hand and say, yes, me, I have a question. You have to have a real question that engages people. Go find a panel where the panelist or the moderator is someone that you would really benefit from engaging with. Ask a real question. Keep asking as many questions as you can get away with. And we've done this where I was the one asking. I had asked 3 questions. That was it. We don't have time for any other questions. But now you've had a conversation with the panelist, the moderator, and with everyone sitting in the crowd where they've heard you talk about solving something or discussing the problem from an angle that's valuable in your world in a way that you couldn't if you were standing on the trade show floor waiting for people. Those people may never have come into the hall that your trade show booth was in, but they were clearly interested in the same topic. So so addressing, like honing in and focusing in on how are we going to talk to the people who are most valuable for us to talk to. And then of course after the trade show, man, you got to keep following up. Just because someone hasn't answered, one of my constant refrains is the only thing that you can conclude from not having heard from someone by email is that you have not heard from someone by email.
That's great. That's a good reminder for all of us every day, by the way, not just in a trade show concept. I love that. All right, I've got one last question, kind of a localized question before we get to our closing segment, when we'll give maybe some guidance on folks in a broader sense. But this last question, I'm just purely curious. We mentioned it in the opening. We've got the Olympics coming up in 2028 here in Los Angeles. Are there companies that you're talking to or that you're already engaged with or that are prospectively thinking about bringing certain solutions, certain products, certain services, technologies to Los Angeles specifically to try and sell that into the Olympics as a market opportunity? Like, or not?
Yes, but also more sort of leveraging the Olympics more broadly. So there are solutions, know-how, products, whatnot, that are specifically relevant for the Olympics and the Olympics context. So, they want to do like low auto use, more public transit, more electric vehicles. So there are a lot of things around that. There are just a lot of things around sustainability. We are actually in the process right now with a bit of a short time frame on this, but we're engaged in a lot of conversations about rebuilding better.
And let's talk about that. Yeah, please, because we haven't touched on that. To give some context, by the way, it's important context for anybody listening on a couple points. One, this is February 24th when we're recording this, and so everything we talked about in the context of American politics and geopolitics throughout the episode, who knows what will be the truth of those things, those questions and answers by the time this episode drops 2, 3, 4 weeks from now, because the world is changing that fast on a daily basis. So I'm learning as a host now in this last month, I have to be very specific about like, oh, we're recording this today. And so the world may come apart at the seams by the time you hear this, and don't hold us accountable to that. So that's part of it. But then the other thing is we haven't talked about the fact that we're recording this episode now about, 4, 5, 6 weeks out from kind of the conclusion of the actual active fires that we had here in Los Angeles. But now in the earliest days and earliest stages of the rebuilding and recovery phase of what will happen here in Los Angeles, which for those who don't remember or didn't hear the story for some reason, right, we had about 7 massive wildfires here over the course of a couple of weeks, 2 of which burned out and essentially destroyed 2 entire neighborhoods on opposite ends of the town. If, as Thomas reminded us earlier, you can imagine the scale of Los Angeles when you close your eyes, it was about 0.045% of the total land mass in Los Angeles. But having said that, it was also about 15 to 18, 19,000 families and homes that have been lost, and then probably another 5 to 6 to 8,000 business structures and business owners, small and medium, large, et cetera, that were lost. So we're the city goes on and life goes on in this massive megalopolis that we live in. But at the same token, in parallel, there's this massive rebuild and recovery going on. So, sorry, with that setup, to take it back to what you were saying, is there's some specific companies and conversations, opportunities that are being had with Traksjon because of people's desire to come in here and maybe help us figure out how to build back better, or how to build houses better, or how to prevent fire spread, or all those types of things, I would imagine.
Yeah, and so for any Danes listening to this, I mean, we have to rebuild the equivalent of the city of Horsens. I mean, I think Horsens is like the populations of about 50 or 60,000. I mean, I think the tally I heard was like 12 or 13,000 homes that have been destroyed. And so there's a Blue Ribbon Commission has been established, and we have multiple friends who are on there from organizations like Climate Resolve, the U.S. Green Building Council of California, the LA Clean Tech Incubator, and Heal the Bay, I know, as well, is in there. UCLA is heavily involved with this, and this is being led by LA County Supervisor Lindsay Horvath. And so there are... I don't want to frame this as a business opportunity, but
it is.
But obviously this is going to be, things are going to be done on commercial terms, but there's an opportunity for Danish companies to show up and say, hey, listen, we know how to do this. There's one of the people that we really want to get out here is this Danish architect Jan Gehl, who is very well known among city planners for having written this book, Cities for People. And so one of the things that I think certainly Northern Europe, Scandinavia, the Nordic countries, maybe Europeans more broadly, are well known for is a more people-centric approach. And although a lot of people around here say, well, we're not Copenhagen or Amsterdam. Yes, but neither was Copenhagen or Amsterdam 40 or 50 years ago. Those were decisions that were made where in Copenhagen, I think, is it 60% or something like that of people ride their bikes to get to work. And then I hear things like, well, you can't do that here because the distances are greater. Yes, but now we have e-bikes, effectively extending the range of reasonable ability to bike to work, but we need infrastructure. So the infrastructure for cycling is the cheapest and most impactful infrastructure that you could, from a transportation perspective. And when I say impactful, there are studies that show that for local shopping, if there is robust cycling infrastructure, if you can ride your bike safely and also park your bike safely near local stores, that can lead to an increase of up to 40% of people shopping locally. Because once you're in your car, it doesn't matter if you drive 5 minutes or 40 minutes. So if parking is so impacted around here that it's often a lot easier to go to a big mall. And so around the fires and the devastation that we've experienced here, there are solutions in Europe, in Northern Europe, where more fire-resistant materials, insulation, which is fire retardant, but which can also help lower energy consumption, both in the wintertime and in the summertime. Different design options, and just a bunch of different solutions. And so we're working on. So if this doesn't drop for 3 or 4 weeks, we're working on bringing an initial group of companies from Northern Europe here. Toward the end of March, so in just about a month from now. But it's going to be an ongoing conversation. We're certainly also in conversation with the Netherlands Business Service Office, LA, about sort of the broader context of just Northern Europe, focus on the Olympics, and we're in conversations also with some larger companies about how can they leverage the Olympics not just for LA, but for the broader context, because it's going to be such a big stage.
Yeah, that's amazing.
A soccer World Cup or real football is coming here. The
26, absolutely.
The Super Bowl, the Olympics and Paralympics are going to be here in 3 years. So we're going to be busy for the next 3.5 years, but also after that.
And I love it in a number of different ways. But it's funny your comment about like, well, the NIMBY pushback of well, we're not Copenhagen, et cetera. Yeah, but that's that mindset of, well, we can't take a solution from a smaller place and then try and extrapolate it on top of the map of all of Los Angeles. Okay, but guess what? Again, these fires, as unfortunate as they are, they have afforded us societally two rather substantially sized, yet still small kind of test areas in which we could do better, right? And we could design better, we could build better, so you don't have to try and show how the solutions in Copenhagen would work at scale across all of Los Angeles. But if you can show how they could transform neighborhoods, in these cases, two very prominent, very large neighborhoods as anchors, then the likelihood that you're able to extrapolate that later and convince other neighborhoods, right? And that's the misnomer I think I talk about a lot online of Los Angeles is it's really just about 120 neighborhoods strewn together by strewn together by a bunch of freeways, right? And if we did better in the neighborhoods as far as how we develop the livability, walkability, public transit accessibility of the neighborhoods, then the freeways can serve their purpose of getting us to those extended, faraway places when we want to or need to. But our lives could exist inside these, as everybody loves to say, since basically like about 2010, like kind of the 15-minute city. Right. But so if we could take what works in Amsterdam and do it in Altadena, right, or works in Copenhagen and do it in the Palisades, that in and of itself would begin to transform Los Angeles and an average Angelino's perception of life. Because then Culver City would look at it, or El Segundo would look at it, or Hollywood would look at it and go, wait a minute, like we did it there, right? We could also bring that and do that to a part of our neighborhood here and begin. And then all of a sudden you wake up 2050, 2060, 2075 when I'm long gone from this mortal coil, right? And we look back and go like, wow, I can't believe like Los Angeles is such a dynamic, walkable city. And then someone like you comes along and goes, well, it wasn't that way 60 years ago.
And people in Chicago are going to be saying, well, we're not Los Angeles,
Right? It was a series of decisions that got made. And now I'll make a funny Chicago reference, being a Chicagoan, born and raised, right? It was a series of decisions that were made, son, in Los Angeles in the wake of the great fires of 2024 and 2025, right? And the destruction that led to that, and the fact that the Olympics were coming at the same time. So the city banded together and decided to start in small ways to reinvent how it existed. And now 75 years later, it's a completely different version of itself. Right. So that's that long view.
You mentioned.
All right, we can talk all day.
If I made just one quick comment. You mentioned NIMBYism, and it's like there's this one thing, that people do business with people, and I think if in the conversation between people, if someone comes in and tries to tell them we need to convert your neighborhood to Copenhagen, that's the wrong way of going about it. And if you ask, well, how do you see this playing out, rather than, well, why do you believe that? People get defensive, and then they tend to be saying things like, well, let's not do that here. Let's do it somewhere else. So anyway.
No, totally agree. And to that point, real quick, an aside story was I've caught a couple of great news stories recently in the last 3-4 weeks about the rebuild after the campfire in Paradise, California, which is far in the northern part of the state, not anywhere near where Thomas and I are recording from today. But there are some obviously great examples because it burned out about 3,000 or 4,000 homes up there and displaced the community in much the same way that these two communities inside of Los Angeles have been displaced. And there are immense lessons, not just like cultural lessons, but operational, tactical product opportunities and ways that things are constructed and regulatory lessons legislatively, et cetera, and they are building their community back to a standard that was better than it existed previously to mitigate what inevitably will happen from a result of climate change as we go forward.
Exactly.
Because we can't exactly. Sadly slow down the climate changing as rapidly as it is. We've already passed that point, right? But we can now begin to kind of gird ourselves for how we want to exist in the best approximation of the world that we live in now, in a future world that is less hospitable to that, through new technologies and new construction models and new products and techniques and all those types of things. Materials was the word I was looking for there. So that's incredible stuff. And I know you're super involved. I'm thankful for the specificity with which you described that Traksjon is involved. But I also know, like, you serve on the LA Metro, which is our metro subway / bus system, our public transit system here in Los Angeles, which is markedly bigger than most people think it is. And I know you serve on their sustainability council. And so I'm sure that obviously, again, opens up a number of kind of windows of opportunity for European companies to, again, much more public transit friendly, much more have a head start on us as far as like sustainable public transit technologies and products. So that's awesome to see those bridges being built. All right. So last question, because again, we could obviously talk for days.
Exactly.
And while that is enjoyable when we're out walking the streets of Hollywood with our coffee, that's not fun for podcast listeners to listen to us on some kind of weird marathon episode. So I have one last question, and it's in the broadest generic sense. Let's go back to kind of relationship building, right? You've clearly shown through your own life story, through the arc of your career in leadership that you've taken and how you've evolved to being the person that you are, advising companies the way that you do very specifically, that you understand how to build relationships, right? I called you a relationship capitalist. That's a phrase that I use to describe myself and a handful of other people. It means you're both very skilled at, but also very serious about the development of human relationships. And it shows in your humanness and kind of your humanity and how you are as a person and how we've kind of come along as now friends, but it also shows in how you do the work that you do based on what you talked about. With all that said, let's give some advice to European or American company leaders in today's world that we live in. And let's be kind of specific about it. What would be 2 or 3 pieces of advice or guidance that you would provide to leaders about how they can or why they should build more effective bridges and relationships and build fewer walls?
Man, that's a good question. Certainly, I feel that this curiosity and what we lead with, unrelenting curiosity, leads to better outcomes and more opportunities and just better possibilities of doing something really terrific, of changing the way that you characterize something. Instead of saying that you're focused on the U.S., think about meeting just one person. I mean, one thing that I tell people is sort of raise your hand virtually. Look at your LinkedIn profile. Send emails to 5 people that you trust and say, we're thinking about the U.S. What's your number one advice? Or can you introduce me to 1 or 2 people who can help us figure out where to start, how to start? But ask big questions. Ask open questions. Don't say things like, hey, do you think it would be a good idea for us to get a trade show booth at this particular trade show? But ask broader. We think we solved this problem. What do you think? What's your insight? Give me your unfiltered opinion. One thing a friend of mine told me, be more Danish, be more direct. It's like there's this great book by Kim Scott, Radical Candor, like be open, be direct. You can still be nice, you can still be kind, but people need some difficult truth. So reach out.
So curiosity. So fueled by curiosity. Second is this idea of
reaching out into your network.
Leverage the relationships that you already have.
Yes. And find out, learn from them. Continue with the curiosity, learn from them. And
ask these types of specific questions. Like don't be shy. Don't you're not being a jerk by being hyper specific. but if you play off of your, especially with relationships that you already have developed, right?
Yes.
Those should be the place that most, I call them friendly.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
That's the place where it's most easy to ask the hard or the very specific questions, because you'll probably get like good, fair feedback because people already are engaged with you or supportive of you.
Exactly. And then the last thing is, be very pragmatic. How will doing this get me closer to my definition of success? How will meeting this person or hiring this person, how will that solve the problem of getting one client? And basically think of this always as like, how will I make $100? Well, we think the market size is more like $1 billion. Yes, but you're not going to get $1 billion in sales tomorrow. Maybe your first sale isn't $1, but if you think about it like that, how will I make $100 sale? How will I sell just one thing?
That's awesome. And that's a great exercise.
Take one step, sell one thing, and from there you build, right? It's like, okay, well, if I do this, I talk to this one person, I can get one more customer. Once you have one customer, ask them also. Then now you have a new friend of sorts, right? It's like, hey, Rob, absolutely, you've just joined here. What made you buy from us?
Yep. You've extended your network. That's awesome. And what I love about this, thank you for this, these bits of advice, because what I love about it is it applies as equally to the European company that's coming here, right? The people that you work with and support and advise currently through Traksjon. But it also just as equally applies to the American entrepreneur or leader who's trying to go to Europe. Definitely. Right? So if you literally just gave the same advice without being hyper specific, but it would just as easily support the success or greater likelihood of success of the American entrepreneur who's landing in Denmark or landing in Finland or landing in Sweden, to take that up. And I know that from my own experiences, because when I landed in Latin America, in South America specifically, having never been there before, I literally did what you just said, for lack of knowing what else to do, and it quote unquote it worked. Like the knowledge that I have, the relationships that I have, the experiences that we had, the business that we eventually developed, but more so kind of the knowledge and personal relationships that no one can ever take away from me, were all developed simply by doing that. Like, oh, you're one person with influence and decision-making capability. That's great. I'm not ready for that outcome yet, but I would like to better understand Chile. And like last night in my apartment, I read up Wikipedia about the history of Chile, and now I've got like 14 questions. If you don't mind, I would love to buy you a cup of coffee. Right. And the one guy that I'm thinking of, who is also a former alumnus of this show now, when I tell this story, is I literally close my eyes and I picture this one particular gentleman. He was like a number 2 guy in the government's Ministry of the Economy. But we had crossed paths in a social setting, and I said exactly what I just said to you. And then he was like, yeah, like, where's your apartment at? And it was like, 2 blocks from their ministerial office of the government in the central district. And he was like, yeah, I always go for coffee at this place on the first Tuesday of every month. If you want to come, like, let's make. And then we did that for like 13 months. And then we also engaged with each other outside of that. But we had a standing, and basically it became like I got a master's in Chilean history. Yeah. From this guy who himself had a fascinating story of how his family had immigrated to Chile and in the 1940s. And so it was this like, and then I would just take that information and knowledge and I would apply it to my other opportunities and relationships in Chile. And then when I was going to go to Argentina, not to make this about me, but I'm just validating your advice to anybody that's listening, this can be done. When I was going to Argentina, I didn't think like we're going to land in Argentina. I literally just talked to the Argentinians that I knew in Chile and just said, hey, I'm going to go to your country. I'm going to go to this city in your country for about 2 weeks. And I'm going to go in a week. Do you have like 4 or 5 people that I should meet and tell them I'll go for a walk with them or buy them a coffee or buy them a beer? And then who should I know? Yeah. And then I was just very fortunate that those people had incredible networks of really good people. And so I landed right into already established trust relationships. And then I just asked lots of questions about stuff that I had no idea about because I had never been to Argentina before. So how would I know? Right. Except for the little bit of homework I did. So again, not about me. I'm not magic. I'm just like you, anybody that's listening. And so if I could do it in my mid to late 40s, dropping into South America where I didn't speak the language and I had never been before, you can surely do it if you're an established business leader in the US or in Europe, talking about the cross-pollination opportunities between Southern California and your country or your home country. So yeah, it's awesome advice. Hey, how we're going to close out, make sure we talk about how we find people. But I first want to how they can connect with you and how they can find the websites and social media and all that stuff. But I want to make sure I just shout out, like, I just want to thank you. What people will never know is that you were a listener of this podcast before I ever knew you, right? So like you were a great example, like a validating story for us as Deanna and the team and I, who put so much passion into this show, that you were a listener of this show who then connected with me. And then we found out that we had a couple of just amazing, really great key people here in Los Angeles in common, which then built an immediate trust level. But then subsequent to that, you and I have now had a chance to visit with each other in person and get to know each other a little bit. And the joy that I take from just the idea that, you know, the one listener, kind of the $100 story, right? Like, how can I make up, like, there's one listener out there that has been so kind as you have been to me, to share your perspectives, to be so enthusiastic about the show, to just enjoy it and then take value from it, is amazing. Because if we, as I tell Deanna after you and I met, right, if we could find the Thomas Riebs of the world out there, and they could find us, and we can make it easier for them to find us, then there are lots and lots of Thomas Riebs in the world that are out there that will enjoy our show, which makes it all worthwhile. So thank you for that. It's awesome to have you on thanks. Now. To have you join the show now as a guest, which is an incredible full circle moment. So.
Well, thanks. No, thanks. And you're absolutely right. And I mean, it's like if not only if you can find me, but I frequently reference other guests that you've had on the podcast, other episodes. In fact, I was just talking to one of our outside business partners just earlier, and I forget his name, who was on a few episodes back, talking about Mexico and the Mexican history.
Alex Gonzalez Omaru,
yes.
who was the publisher of the Mexico Political Economist, which is one of the fastest growing resource newsletters in that talks about this issue right now.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because that's a terrific example of one of the guests that you have on, the perspective that you bring is. This is a perspective that you don't necessarily hear through mainstream media, and certainly not in the noise of everything that's going on with our politics right now, but it really dives into the history and the meaning of the history and sort of the data, but what does the data actually mean? And I just love that the one story that he told you about the Mexican president and LBJ meeting and saying, yes, drugs coming through Mexico are a problem, but Mexico is the springboard. The U.S. is where the demand is, and the demand is the pool. And if you close the pool, no one's going to worry about the springboard. And this is 60 years ago,
right? And Alex is also a great wordsmith, so he's a great storyteller in that context. But thank you. That's a great example. And then before we make sure we give the social sites and the website and everything, so people can find the firm and you. I will drop one quick reference. You referenced Third Culture Child, or Third Culture Kid, which I have no idea where you picked that up in your life, but I can tell you one place for sure that you've been exposed to it, or that people will be exposed to that concept, and it was with Carol Shi, who's a previous guest of the show.
Nice.
We talked about being a third culture child between Taiwan and the U.S. when she showed up here in Los Angeles and sight unseen with a bunch of cash in her pocket to be sent by her parents back in the Far East to go to school in the U.S. and wound up picking Long Beach State or Cal State Long Beach, and now has a thriving e-commerce business here in the U.S. and is a mover and shaker in her community, and also just an amazing woman. But she spent a good chunk of that episode educating on us on what this third culture child is, and that was fascinating. I had never heard of the concept, and so again, I learned stuff every time we talk. So. How do we find you? How do we find the firm online, et cetera?
The firm online, www.traksjon.com. Traksjon spelled in the Norwegian way, Traksjon. Traksjon.com. Also, you can find us on LinkedIn, LinkedIn, whatever it is, just search for us on LinkedIn. You can reach me, Thomas R, at Traksjon, TRAKSJON.com. And I think...
And find your newsletter, which
Yes.
you publish that. You can find that on LinkedIn. I know for sure. That's where I subscribe.
Yeah, so that's on LinkedIn. It's called Traksjon in the US. It's on, if you look for me, my name's Thomas Riebs, R-I-E, B as in Bravo, S as in Sierra. You can find my LinkedIn Traksjon in the US if you search for newsletters. You can also find it on the Traksjon page on LinkedIn. I'm sure you can probably find some likes or reposts from you.
Yes.
So that's
it's a great newsletter. There's a version of it. I would say episode. My podcasters had. There's an edition of the newsletter that is out in which Thomas goes into great detail about the rebuilding and recovery opportunity and efforts here in Los Angeles in the wake of the fires, as we talked about before. So be sure to check that out and subscribe. And if you're a European business leader who's listening to this, like you just had the 85-minute commercial on why you guys should do business with Traksjon and Thomas. And if you're an American business leader here in Los Angeles specifically, or in the region as a whole, and you want to better understand or better connect with the Danish economy or with European business and economies at large for various reasons, or you want those companies or types of companies and products to be brought into your markets here across Southern California, Traksjon and the team is the team for you to build the relationships with. So we hope, as we always say, we hope that you enjoy this episode as much as we did making it. So Thomas, thank you, buddy. It was a great conversation.
Thanks, Rob. As always, a pleasure. I'm looking forward to our next walkabout in Hollywood.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did recording it. As always, we thank you so much for listening and watching. Today's show was recorded here in Los Angeles and produced by the incomparable Deanna Bernal in Mexico City. You know, we can only grow this show by you listening and sharing the show with friends. So please find, like, follow, subscribe, and share our audio-only show on Spotify, Apple, or via any other popular podcasting platforms, as well as find the video version of our show now available on our YouTube channel over at Entrepreneurial Thinkers. And of course, you can follow along on our various social media platforms for fun and informative clips and content at Entrepreneurial Thinkers, wherever you can find us. And if you'd like to connect with me, you can find me at I Am Rob Ryan on just about any social media platform. Gracias, thank you, and have an awesome day.